So again, if everybody could gather in, take a seat, and give your full attention to my good friend and colleague, Chelsea Stallings. I'm going to give it over to you. Thanks for being here.
All right, thanks everyone. I just want to, before we get started, I want to go back and touch on something that Jessica had in her presentation earlier. So if you guys all have a phone or a device, I want you guys to look something up for me really quick. Pull out your phone and Google this picture that's on the screen, the John B. Denton burial. I want you to look this picture up. I tried to zoom it in the break. But if you zoom in right into the very center of this picture, you're looking at what is the entrance of recycled books today. You should see a sign in a window on that picture that says dentist. But zoom in underneath that and you can see in the background of this picture that there is a lone black boy, I would say maybe no older than 12 or 13, and he's frozen in fear in the background of this picture of John B. Denton's burial. If you really take some time to analyze what's going on in this picture, you can see that there are so many white people in the forefront selling the burial of, I guess, pig bones now. I didn't know that. We have pig bones on our lawn. All these white people celebrating this burial, but there is one black child frozen in fear in the background, right catty corner from where I'm standing right now. On the screen, should be over towards the left. But I want you guys to remember this because this is a picture that the Office of History and Culture that Denton County really likes to put out there. But if you take the time to zoom in, you'll see visual representation of black people not being allowed on the square.
Yeah, he's there.
And kind of off to the side, you can see it looks like his wagon or something. And if anyone is a Photoshop wizard and wants to try to zoom in on that and get a good quality picture, that'd be really cool. All I've seen are these grainy ones. So again, my name is Chelsea Stallings. I am a PhD student. I'm at TCU, but I'm a two-time alum at UNT. This is where I did my thesis. So I'm just going to read it off to you about Quakertown. Just really quick, everyone who's here, raise your hand if you've heard of Quakertown. That's good. That's pretty good. How many of you have been to the Quakertown House Museum that's sitting over here in the park?
You have some behind you too.
Oh, we've got hands back here, yeah. So I'm going to be talking about Quakertown today. This home that is over here was a house that was in Quakertown. It was discovered less than 20 years ago. It's really interesting to note that this house, that the Black history of Denton County is still segregated. It's still pushed over here to the historical park. It's not really encompassed and incorporated into the central history. So just kind of reiterating some of what Jessica said earlier, Denton was established in 1857 as the seat of Denton County. But by 1920, the city's African-American residents accounted for 9% of the population. The population of Denton by 1920 was about 7,600. There were the 5 public schools, there were 13 churches, and there were 2 colleges. The North Texas State Normal College, that's UNT today, it was formed in 1890, just off that building right over there, and the College of Industrial Arts called CIA. By 1920, Denton's African-American residents accounted for 9% of the population. There were several all-black communities that had developed throughout Denton following emancipation, but the most populous was Quakertown. Its central location just north of the county square was key to its significance. The area was chosen for a variety of reasons. Just north of here. First, already mentioned, it was close to the county square. Second, the Fred Douglass Colored School had been established there in 1878. Third, agricultural and economic opportunities were available in the North Texas region. Denton's rich productive soil and inexpensive land attracted formerly enslaved men and women. However, though, it was most likely chosen because it was off of the Pecan Creek of the Elm Fork of the Trinity River. It's a water source. People go where they can get water. Because the creek was prone to flooding, it was most likely considered undesirable to white citizens, and therefore it was deemed an acceptable area by those white citizens for freedmen and freedwomen to settle. By 1920, Quakertown was considered both a business district and a middle-class neighborhood. It can be classified as middle class for 4 reasons. the rate of home ownership, residents' job statuses, the quality and quantity of the material possessions they owned, and the level of social activities that the residents enjoyed. According to the 1920 census, there were 80 households in Quakertown. 58 of those were black families, while the other 22 were white. Of the black homes, 67% were owned and not rented. 29 of the black homeowners had their homes paid off and no mortgage payment. And most significantly, 15 of the homeowners were old enough to have been born into slavery and were homeowners by 1920. That's pretty impressive. That's pretty impressive, considering what we just heard of what they had to face every day of their lives. Businesses in Quakertown included the Smith Cafe, Crawford's Grocery Store, the Allen Restaurant, a boarding house, which is a hotel today, Skinner's Shoe Shop, Dr. Moten's Medical and Dental Practice, Quaker Tailor Shop, Citizens Undertaking Funeral Parlor, the Buffalo Bayou Cafe, a drugstore, a confectionery, and 3 barber shops. All of these businesses were owned by Quakertown residents. Those who didn't own businesses were wage earners such as cooks, hotel waiters, or store porters, domestics employed in private homes, as Jessica talked about, laundresses who took in laundry, and city or public laborers who did various jobs. Several residents were landlords who owned homes that they rented out for profit. One homeowner was Miss Angeline Burr. She owned multiple properties, and she was one of the few who had been old enough to have been born into slavery and was a homeowner. Several residents also owned automobiles. Quakertown's wealth was also manifest in its residents' consumption of luxury goods. Residents wore up-to-date fashions, such as thick fur coats for winter, decorative wide-brimmed hats for special occasions, and delicate light material for breezy white summer dresses. Children were also not overlooked when it came to quality clothing. Young children were seen wearing high-quality shirts, shorts, socks, shoes, winter coats, everything. Parents also saw that their children had the most current toys. They had tricycles with ponies on the seats. They played with wagons and dolls. Infants rested in elaborate rocking carriages. Quakertown residents went to great lengths to keep their neighborhood aesthetically pleasing and to combat sickness. Many of the streets and sidewalks in Quakertown were paved. I want you to note that for a minute. Many of the streets and sidewalks in a black neighborhood in Denton, Texas in 1920 were paved. There were many streets in central Denton that weren't even paved. Telephone and electric lines ran through the neighborhood. Henry Taylor, a self-identified laborer who is employed as a master gardener for a white family, took such pride in his own garden featuring a rare white lilac bush that his yard was sometimes referred to as the Park of Quakertown. Most residents had at least a small garden and several animals, thus having regular access to their own seasonal food. And a well in the center of the community provided fresh water, and when residents got sick, they received prescriptions from Dr. Edwin Moten. Residents were invested in their community not only financially and aesthetically, but also socially. Men were involved in business organizations such as the Citizens Business League, which was the black equivalent of the Denton Chamber of Commerce, while others were involved in fraternal organizations such as the Knights and Daughters of Tabor. Women were involved in social activities as well. They hosted parties to celebrate events such as weddings, anniversaries, social dinners, and lunches at which they served extravagant dishes. They also participated in one of many women's clubs, such as the Jewel Arts Club or the Busy Bee Club, which served as forms of entertainment and focused on beautification of the Fred Douglass School. The various clubs sponsored socials to raise funds for school improvements, such as installing water on the grounds. Students were involved with school activities such as hiking, celebrating holidays, playing sports, and performing in the choral club. Many had goals of advancement in life and went on to continue their education at colleges such as Paul Quinn, Wiley, and Prairie View. Quakertown residents were also involved in their church activities, and 2 churches had their own society groups: the Ministers Alliance of the Pleasant Grove Baptist Church and the Christian Endeavor Society of the St. James AME. These societies conducted rallies, held beauty contests, annual Easter egg hunts, celebrated baptisms, and celebrated holidays. By 1920, Quakertown residents had established a thriving communal and business neighborhood through both financial and social investments. Residents not only owned their own homes, but they displayed ample material finery and technology. They enjoyed economic freedoms, formed civic organizations, and strove to make substantial improvements within their community. Most importantly, though, is that they did all of this nearly completely free of dependency upon the white community. And this type of black self-sufficiency and autonomy existed outside of the Jim Crow dictatorship, which is everything that Jessica just talked about earlier, and therefore was the exact reason white Denton began publicly vocalizing disapproval of the black community in 1914. The white vision in the early 20th century stipulated black dependency upon white, and these race relations, as we just heard, were tightly controlled. Although the city of Denton had a bustling business center on the county square, its two main economic assets were the colleges, and their contributions to Denton growth were behind most of white Denton's decision on city enhancement. In May of 1913, city officials choreographed a parade celebrating the town's prominent educational status and hired a cameraman to film this event. This video was recently uncovered, I'd say within the last 10 years, by the Denton County Office of History and Culture. They had it on a loop for a while, several years back, this educational rally of just like thousands of students and all white, teachers, white students, all marching on the square. The parade hosted city officials, over 3,000 college students, the 1913 senior class of Denton High, and faculty from most of the public schools marching on the courthouse. However, no black representation from Fred Douglass appears that day, as they had not been invited. For years by this time, student and faculty of the Fred Douglass School had experienced regular forced exclusion from Denton. The school had been one of the first buildings in the Quakertown community, and although recorded information about the early years is limited, in 1895, principal and Quakertown homeowner Henry Bell, which Bell Street is named after a visit to a Dallas school, he stated that, I'm gonna wait. Black lives matter, y'all.
Black lives matter.
Black lives matter.
Black lives matter. Black lives matter. Black lives matter.
Black lives matter. Black lives matter. Black lives matter. Black lives matter. Black lives matter.
Black lives matter.
In 1895, we've got all day and all night. We're not going anywhere. That's fine. In 1895, principal and Quakertown homeowner Henry Bell, after a visit to a Dallas school, stated that the Denton Colored School, from a standpoint of scholarship, is not second to the Dallas schools. So after hearing everything Jessica was saying about the education, I had no idea until today just how much trouble that they had to go through. I'm not surprised at all by it, but to hear them talk about how proud they are of their education, it's worth something. But when students arrived at school on the first day in September 1913 at Fred Douglass School, about 4 months after the educational rally video, they discovered that the building had been burned to the ground. One student at the time was Rosalie Daniels, and her family had been staying with Principal Bell and their family. And when she was interviewed nearly 80 years later, she recalled the event in detail, and she said, "We wasn't under Professor Bell and them too long before the school burned. They think somebody said it. They were bound to. Wasn't no electricity or nothing in it." The official report of the burning came in the city's only newspaper, the Denton Record-Chronicle. It was the only newspaper at this time. The inconclusive finding listed the cause as unknown. Surprise. But Daniels had memory of the burning as an act of arson. The school was rebuilt in a few years' time, but it wasn't built in Quakertown, but on the southeast side of Denton. And that's going to be where the Fred Moore School is today. The educational rally and the subsequent burning of the black school in 1913 were not coincidental, and that was the same year that CIA hired a new president. His arrival is just in time for when the KDDAF and UDC chapter and when the KKK began starting their efforts. When the College of Industrial Arts had been created in 1901, Quakertown was already an established neighborhood directly to its south by at least 20 years. The college was founded as an institute of higher education for white women only, and as such, it attracted small town and rural girls from across the state. The initial relationship between Quakertown and CIA was pretty much just one of proximity. When Denton was chosen as the site of the college in 1901, neither the school nor Quakertown were large enough to disrupt one another. But North Texas' constant economic development changed that by 1920. As CIA grew, prominent leaders of both the college and the white community began looking upon Quakertown as a blemish. Despite the community's financial and social achievements, white residents honed in on the, quote, and I quote, mud-lined streets, laundry-filled yards, and profusion of black children, and thus considered Quakertown dirty. CIA's inability to coexist with Quakertown worsened under the new president, Francis Marion Braley. When he arrived, he immediately made school expansion his top priority. Prior to 1913, CIA had only granted 2-year degrees. Within 2 years after his arrival, the college began awarding its first Bachelor's of Science. All CIA buildings that had been erected and established before Braley arrived, they were remodeled and expanded, and several others were built as well. He immersed himself in Denton's civic affairs, including the Chamber of Commerce, the Rotary Club, the Board of the Christian Church of Denton, and Board of Regents of the Normal College. He was a Mason and a Knights of Pythias member. His experience as a state employee and his ascension to numerous civic offices made Braley one of the most powerful men in the city in Denton by 1920. Around the time of Braley's arrival in Denton, the most pressing civic issue in white Denton was locating a space large enough to house a public park and host the county fair. The city's central location made it the heart of the county, but its constant growth and development were encroaching on land large enough to host the fair and rodeo. And I'm going to skip some of this. Basically, a lot of the members of the Katy Dath and UDC started pressing this issue of finding a county park because it just made such a nice, perfect thing for them to say in public. In January 1913, the Katy Dath and UDC, as Jessica said, entered into contract. I'm going to skip all that. The idea of a public park also circulated around Denton for years before its fruition. Articles regularly appeared in the DRC calling for a creation of a city park as early as 1913. And I think Jessica said this earlier, but CIA professor C.N. Atkinson, he was one of the first to publicly suggest it in 1914. Tried a bunch of different locations by 1920. By late 1920, Braley had the full support of the Women's Club and Denton's business and civic leaders due to his CIA accomplishments. He focused his attention then on Quakertown as the only limitation to CIA's growth, and he came up with the solution. During a November meeting of the Rotary Club, he voiced a bold opinion. Denton could rid the college of the menace of the Negro quarters and thereby remove the danger that is always present so long as the situation remains as it is, and that could be done in a business way and without friction. In order to remove the community in a business way, he looked no further than the Women's Club. Braley's suggestion was to remove the Quakertown neighborhood and place it with the park. And word spread quickly, and by December 1920, the Women's Club, Chamber of Commerce, and the Rotary Club had backed his suggestion. Later that month, CIA hosted the annual Chamber of Commerce banquet where Braley announced Quakertown as the chosen site. Not only would removing the Quakertown residents provide room for both a new civic center park and CIA expansion, but it would also remove the black neighborhood from the center of town. The solution was praised by all in attendance at the banquet. Their lives were disposable, is what that means. Their lives didn't matter. Within a few days, the proposal became a full-fledged movement across town. On December 29, 1920, the DRC officially reported the decision about Quakertown. White citizens filed a petition with the city in January of 1921, and the vote, which became known as the Park Bond issue, was scheduled for April 5th. The first 3 months of 1921 saw an extensive campaign in which the Women's Club canvassed the entire town, exhorting residents to vote in favor of the new park. On that day, only 367 voted in support of the new park, while 240 voted against it, with the margin of only 127 votes. Responses to the verdict among Quakertown residents varied. A fight broke out in the Quakertown community just a few hours after the decision. Some formed a committee within a few days in hopes of assisting the city commissioners in locating a new neighborhood. Others were less willing to compromise. Resident and homeowner Will Hill was so incensed at the city's decision that he proceeded to file a lawsuit. The threat of his lawsuit, as well as the formation of a committee, were both useless because at this point the city commissioners, and I quote, were favorable to a segregation district for the Negroes in order that they may be protected for the future. Quakertown residents were not only going to be removed from their community, but they were not allowed to be a part of the process that would determine where they could resettle. A few months after the verdict, the city took its first steps towards securing the Quakertown land. A park bond committee was formed by city commissioners, and homeowners had the choice of having their homes physically relocated to a new district, still undetermined at the time, or selling their homes to the city to be demolished. The first homes were purchased in October 1921, signing the beginning of the end of Quakertown. By May 1922, the removal of the black neighborhood was underway, but slowed by negotiations over costs. Both the white and black communities discussed several possible locations for the new neighborhood. For example, one potential area just east of CIA was so favorable to Quakertown residents that boarding house owner Henry Maddox sold his property to the city and had his structures relocated there in early summer. So this area is about where the golf course is today. He purchased 20 acres with the intention of selling some to his neighbors that were surely to follow. I mean, this is, you can purchase this much land, have all your houses moved, like, this was a wealthy man. However, within 2 weeks of his settlement, Braley publicly disproved of Maddox's relocation. If they were allowed to settle east of the CIA, we would have about the same condition we are trying to remedy by buying their property for a park site. So he openly admitted, we just don't want them near us. Around the same time, 2 petitions circulated through Denton and ended up at City Council, garnering hundreds of signatures along the way, both specifying limitations to where the black community should be allowed to settle. Only white people are signing these petitions. A week after the petitions, Maddox was visited by 2 white citizens who told him that he was not allowed to live east of CIA. On the same day, 2 notices appeared in Quakertown from the KKK. The notes read, "Negroes take notice, no building, no moving east of CIA, north of the railroad, or south of Jace Walker's. Those already there will be given time to sell their property and move. Understand?" By early summer, no satisfactory area to relocate the community had been approved. In July, white landowner Albert Miles, his land was east of the railroad depot, not far from here. He approached the city about offering his land, which was about to be foreclosed upon. The area was near an open sewage pit and has been described by local historians as a converted cow pasture with no utilities and a severe mosquito problem. Soon after Miles' offer, the city accepted it and they began moving homes. Their homes were hoisted up on logs and pulled by mules at midnight, one by one, to the new segregated neighborhood, which would now be known as Solomon Hill. Unsurprisingly, many Quakertown residents didn't want to sell their homes. Several in acts of resistance waited as long as possible before conceding. Around the same time, the KKK was experiencing their resurgence in Denton. That year saw 1922 to 1924 saw Texas memberships reaching 150,000 and over 2 million nationally. 1922 was a midterm election year, and in Texas, the KKK as a voting bloc elected state legislators, sheriffs, judges, and took hold of many city governments, including Dallas and Fort Worth. They also elected a federal senator, who was running on a KKK platform. Until summer of 1922, White Denton appears to have been civil during discussions in the facilitation of the removal of the homes. But once the KKK arrived in Denton, the remainder of the relocation process, they didn't even try to hide the violence anymore. When interviewed in 2006, former Quakertown resident Norvell Hill Reed recalled her family's stories of KKK activity and the trauma of their removal. "I think that my mother said my uncle, my daddy's brother, had the first house moved over there. They said the Klan or some of them set it on fire. I don't know if they just knew that it was the Klan. It was just people that resented the sale of the property to African Americans. They did it to let the blacks know that they resented it that much." In early August of 1922, a reverend from Austin named W.A. Hamlet gave a speech on the county courthouse lawn entitled "The Principles of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan." He was newly hired by the KKK as a national lecturer, and this lecture was a part of a 2-week tour circuit in Texas. So not only Denton, but they went to San Antonio, Austin, Sweetwater, and Abilene. It was heavily advertised in the DRC. Denton Mayor H.V. Hennon warmly welcomed Hamlet to the crowd, and hundreds came out to hear his words. His words said, "Are you against a white man's government? Then don't cast slurs on a white man's organization. Be a white man or get out of a white man's country." Within a month's time after the speech, at least 3 Denton Klan initiations occurred. In mid-August, 96 initiations took place. The very next night, 163 more. In early September, 40 more. With hundreds of new members in 1 month, the Denton KKK was a full-fledged, open, prominent force in Denton. Most Quakertown residents were resettled in Solomon Hill by this time and were in the process of reestablishing their community and what they had lost. Plans were approved by the city to begin construction on new church buildings to replace those that had been demolished. In the interim, they shared a temporary tabernacle for religious services. But on September, immediately following the Klan initiation of 40 people, 6 hood and robed men carrying lighted crosses entered the tabernacle in the middle of a service and handed the pastor a note that said, "Worship God, but go pick cotton." The next day, the city attorney began an investigation. He stated that he could positively identify 4 of the members, but without sufficient evidence, he didn't name his suspects. If you have a police officer who can tell you who did a racial crime, but he's not going to name anyone, he's part of the problem. He's a suspect. He did it. 2 weeks later, another service at the tabernacle was once again interrupted. This time, attendees were pelted with eggs. None saw who threw them, and by the time the city marshal and officer arrived, there was no one outside the building. Less than a week later, the tabernacle was set on fire and burned completely to the ground. Again, no evidence was ever recovered to determine the cause, but the city police admitted that an attempt to ignite the structure had been reported the night before. As with all the other investigations, no suspects were ever named and all were soon dropped. Within a few months after the tabernacle violence, all of the families and homes had been removed from Quakertown. Many who were financially able to leave Denton had done so, such as Dr. Moten. Their homes were torn down by the city. The rest had been hauled away to the southeast side of the railroad tracks, which would soon be regarded by white Denton as Shacktown. Once black residents were in Solomon Hill, there was nothing they could do other than reestablish the community that had been dismantled. By 1923, all of the homes were out of the former Quakertown neighborhood and the land was cleared and prepared for construction on the new park. Solomon Hill residents worked to reinstate much of what had been lost, which over time did grow to include a grocery store, cleaners, a movie theater, all kinds of restaurants, and a funeral home. Although there was never an official city rule banning their presence, the displaced residents were clearly no longer welcome to the new park. Quakertown homeowner, Reverend Willie Clark, never trusted white people again, and his wife, Alma, who is still living today, she's still living over in Southeast Denton. She's a wonderful woman. His wife, Alma, later recalled he didn't even want to go down into the park or go near it because he did not like the memories that it brought about. In 1928, a new women's club building was finished, making it the first new structure on the park property. So the White United Front, which had really begun its efforts in 1913, had accomplished what they had set out to do, eliminating the black autonomous community to proclaim the space for themselves instead. And I'm done. The only thing I just want to point out to you guys is we've heard a lot about like what the historical continuity is today of how white supremacy in Denton has looked. We've heard about mayor after mayor after mayor after mayor who has led KKK parades. He has allowed KKK members into the building. They have been here for the opening and the initiation of this monument. We now have a mayor who is still suppressing black people, black voices, black bodies from this square. Can you all see the historical continuity of what even just the mayors in the city of Denton are doing, how this ideology persists today? I just want you guys to take this away. And I'm going to turn it back over to Jessica. And once again, you guys, Black Lives Matter. Woo!
All right, so once again, really quickly, I would like you all to do me a favor. I'd like you all to give yourselves a round of applause for coming out today and being a part of history, being willing to come out and hear things that are hard to hear, to have difficult conversations so that we can move forward.